And I want to talk about the Cold War today. As I mentioned last time, Americans didn't spend a whole lot of time or energy thinking about the Soviet Union or thinking about communism, really, during the 1920s and 1930s. It was, some interesting things were happening in the Soviet Union, but for the most, and there was a small American Communist Party, but for the most part, Americans weren't paying any attention. But then, Hitler invades the Soviet Union in June 1941. America gets pulled into the war in December 1941, and now we're on the same side as the Soviet Union. And during World War II, Americans said lots of really nice things about the Soviet Union and Stalin. There's Franklin Roosevelt sharing a laugh with Stalin at the Tehran conference. After meeting Stalin there, Roosevelt told the press, "I believe we are going to get along very well with Marshal Stalin and the Russian people, very well indeed." And so the American media helped out. Life magazine ran a big feature on the Soviet Union in March 1943. According to Life magazine, the Russians are, quote, "a hell of a people who look like Americans, dress like Americans, and think like Americans." According to Life magazine, the Soviet secret police was just like their version of the FBI. Collier's magazine, a couple of months later, did a feature on the Soviet Union and said, "What kind of country is Russia anyway? A modified capitalist setup, moving towards something resembling our own and Great Britain's democracy." And magazines and newsreels were filled with pictures of American and Soviet pilots working together to plan things to drop on the Nazis. It was all one big happy family fighting Germany, at least according to the American media. Delusional for sure, but that was the dominant theme during the war. The rhetoric changes, of course, a great deal as soon as the war is over. In February 1946, just a few months after the war ended, Stalin gave a speech to the senior members of the Communist Party in Russia. In orthodox Marxist fashion, he blamed monopoly capitalism for World War II. And he warned that the ultimate war between communism and capitalism was inevitable. A month later, Winston Churchill comes to the United States to visit, and with Harry Truman, the president, sitting next to him, he delivers a speech at Westminster College in Missouri. And Churchill, in his speech, and there's the typewritten script that Churchill was working from, Churchill said that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The communist parties are seeking everywhere to obtain totalitarian control. Police governments are prevailing in nearly every case. And Churchill was right. And the process continued over the next several years. Between 1946 and 1948, the communists took control in alphabetical order of Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Yugoslavia. They rigged elections, they outlawed opposing parties, and they began socializing industry. Now, communist parties were also getting stronger in Western Europe. In the first post-war election in France, the French Communist Party got 30% of the vote. The communist parties in Western Europe, not in Great Britain, but on the continent, like France and Italy, were strong, powerful, organized, and real vote-getters. Two of the countries in Europe that Americans were particularly worried about, and worried about the strength of communism, were Greece and Turkey. And if you look at the map, you can see both Greece and Turkey border either Soviet-controlled countries or the Soviet Union itself. Economic conditions in Greece and Turkey were very bad after the war. The local communist parties in those two countries were getting stronger and stronger. Up until early 1947, it had been Great Britain that was trying to was providing financial aid to the governments of Greece and Turkey. But in February of 1947, the British informed the United States that they were running out of money. They could no longer afford to help the governments of Greece and Turkey. So Truman and Dean Acheson, that's the fellow with the mustache on the slide there, he was the Undersecretary of State. Truman and Acheson meet with top congressional leaders to try to figure out what to do. Acheson warned the congressional leaders that if Greece and Turkey fell, communism would spread all the way to India. This was an early example of what became known as the domino theory. Once communism conquers a country, takes over in a country, its neighbors are in danger, and the neighbors will start falling, and the trend is almost inevitable. So they warn congressional leaders that there's a serious threat to the world itself, really. And the leading Republican in the Senate, Arthur Vandenberg, that's the other fellow on the slide, he advised Truman to scare the hell out of the American people if he wanted to get help for Greece and Turkey. So Truman decided to do exactly that. And he went to Congress in March 1947 and gave a very, very important speech. Truman said that at the present moment in world history, nearly every nation must choose between alternative ways of life, and the choice too often is not a free one. One way of life is based upon the will of the majority and is distinguished by free institutions, free elections, individual liberty, freedom of speech and religion, and freedom from political oppression. The second way of life is based upon the will of a minority forcibly imposed upon the majority. It relies on terror, oppression, a controlled press and radio, fixed elections, and the suppression of personal freedoms. The key point then. I believe it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. This is the first really big public statement by an American leader that divides the world into good and evil. Basically, the world is now a morality play in which freedom and oppression are fighting everywhere on the globe. And Truman is basically saying it has to be American policy to help the free peoples of the world stay free anywhere on the globe. I mean, the change in vision from what we talked about the last time, where Americans spent most of the 20s and 30s trying to pretend that things weren't happening in the rest of the world, that scary things weren't happening in the rest of the world. Now you have the president telling Congress and telling the American people, scary things are happening everywhere, and we have to be ready to step in and to help. Congress approved the $400 million that Truman had asked for, that just for Greece and Turkey. That would be about $6 billion today. But it wasn't just Greece and Turkey. And if you think about the state of Europe after the war and the potential for the communists to reach out to people who were suffering after the war, I've just found a few photos. You look on the internet sometime of what much of Europe looked like when the war was over. I mean, the rebuilding process must have been staggering. You had homes and factories destroyed, farming in very bad shape, poor harvests. People were nearly starving throughout the continent. So it wasn't just Greece and Turkey. America might well need to help the rest of Europe to recover from the war. So a couple of months after Truman went to Congress, Secretary of State George Marshall, who had been the commander of the U.S. military during the war, but now he's Secretary of State, he goes to the Harvard commencement, and he gives an address at the Harvard commencement. There's a photo, that's Marshall in the center in the suit talking to someone with one of those funny hats on. If you're interested who the other people are, the guest on the far left, that's J. Robert Oppenheimer. They were also giving a degree to him. And then the fellow on the far right, who does not look happy to me at all, is the poet T.S. Eliot, a Harvard graduate who must also have been getting an award and was, I'm guessing, not looking forward to making a speech, but I could be wrong. In any event, the star of the show that day was Marshall, and Marshall invited the countries of Europe to ask for American aid to rebuild. And American leaders had two very, very good reasons for trying to help Europe rebuild. One was to try to neutralize the impact of the communist parties and the appeal that they might have. If the peoples of France and Italy and Germany were in better material shape, they'd be less susceptible to communist influence. That was one part of the reasoning. The other was, everybody's a bit worried about whether the Depression's going to come back. I mean, at the moment, nobody knows that the post-war years are going to be an economic boom. And so there were a lot of American leaders and businessmen who were worried, who are we going to sell all our stuff to? And we need to rebuild Europe so that Europeans will be a market for American industry. So there were practical reasons and political reasons. Congress approved more than $13 billion of aid between 1948 and 1952. It would be $180 billion in today's dollars. Massive influx of American money to help rebuild Europe. To help organize America as the defender of the free world, a couple months later, Congress passed the National Security Act. It merged, up until then, the Army Department and the Navy Department were separate. It merged them into the Department of Defense. It created a National Security Council as advisors to the president, and it created the Central Intelligence Agency as to have a permanent organization that would provide intelligence and would also engage in covert activities, as we'll hear in a couple minutes. Now, the first real showdown in the Cold War, the first visible conflict really, took place concerning Germany. There never was a peace treaty with Germany. France, Britain, and the United States each had an occupation zone. They merged their zones. The Russians had an occupation zone that they kept separate. And by 1948, 1949, you had Germany divided into two occupation zones. Berlin, the capital of Germany, is located about 100 miles inside the Soviet zone, and it too was divided. So there was a West Berlin run by the Americans and the British and the French, and an East Berlin run by the Soviets. In June 1948, Stalin closed the German border and refused to allow Americans access to West Berlin. How are you going to supply the people of West Berlin? Truman's military advisors wanted him to use the U.S. Army to bulldoze their way through. Rather than declare war on the Soviet Union, Truman opted for an airlift. And over the next year, just about, American planes, I need my slide. There we are. American planes flew over 300,000 flights carrying supplies to West Berlin. The Soviets chose not to try to shoot down the planes, and after about a year, Stalin just got tired of it. His blockade wasn't working, and he lifted the blockade. But in the meantime, it was American planes that had kept West Berlin fed. As the 40s were ending, Europe is now divided into two armed camps. In July 1949, the Senate ratified the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was the first time America entered in a formal alliance in peacetime. Some of you will remember when George Washington left office, he warned the nation against ever getting pulled into foreign entanglements. And America avoided peacetime alliances all the way through until the Cold War period. NATO was our first such treaty. The Soviets countered with what they called the Warsaw Bloc. And so you have the countries in NATO showing on that map in green, the Soviet Union and its bloc in the sort of dark tan color, whatever that is. And then the light tan are countries that are technically not part of either one. like Spain, Switzerland, Austria. Yugoslavia didn't belong to the Soviet bloc officially, but it was under communist control under Marshal Tito. But Tito tried to be communist, but independent of the Soviets. Now, as I think I mentioned at the end of the last lecture, America ended World War II with an amazing majority of the world's resources, majority of the world's economic power, manufacturing power, gold reserves, oil production. But it didn't take very long before Americans sort of started getting anxious about their place in the world, even with all that power. And a number of things started undermining American confidence in the late 40s. One of them was when it turned out that the Soviets had tested an atomic bomb. That happened, the announcement came in August of 1949. That was way sooner than most Americans had thought the Soviets could do it. The Soviets did round up some German scientists at the end of the war. That helped them a little bit, but we underestimated the capability of Soviet science. So now the United States doesn't have a monopoly any longer, and now the Russians could theoretically drop a bomb on Western Europe. If they had the right kind of a plane, they could do it. In response to the Soviets developing the atomic bomb, Truman authorized a program to develop the hydrogen bomb. Now, many scientists, including Einstein, had urged them not to develop the hydrogen bomb because it was so much more powerful. This could kill millions of people at one time. Truman asked his advisors, "So, do you think the Russians are working on a hydrogen bomb?" And his advisor said, "Of course we think they are." And then, so Truman said, "Well, I have no choice, so we have to do it too." The first successful test of a hydrogen bomb took place in 1952 when we blew up an island in the Pacific. That first test was 500 times more powerful than the bomb that obliterated Hiroshima. 500 times. I don't know what the ratio is today, but they've obviously gotten way more powerful today than they were back then. A few months later, another shock to the American ego was the fall of the Chinese government to the communists. The United States had supplied the government of Chiang Kai-shek with $2 billion of aid during the 30s and early 40s. Nevertheless, the communist movement grew steadily, and in 1949, the communists took power. Mao Zedong was the leader, with Zhou Enlai assisting him. Republicans blamed the Democrats, Truman and the Democrats, for, and this was the word they used, losing China, as if somehow American policy could have prevented the success of the communists in a country that had 540 million people. The idea that Democrats lost China lingered for years and was an effective part of the message that Senator McCarthy used during the Red Scare. Beside the fall of China and the Soviet atomic bomb, there were some high-profile espionage cases that scared Americans as to what the danger of communism within the country. Whittaker Chambers, a senior editor at Time magazine, told a House committee that he had been a Soviet spy in the 1930s. He named names, and one of the names he threw out there was Alger Hiss. He's the fellow on the top of that slide. Hiss was a graduate of Harvard Law School, a veteran of several New Deal agencies, and he had been part of the State Department team at the Yalta Conference. Hiss denied that he was a communist. He then sued Whittaker Chambers for libel. Chambers reveals microfilms that he had gotten from Hiss, and Chambers came up with convincing evidence that, in fact, Hiss had been a spy. The statute of limitations on espionage had run out, but they charged Hiss with perjury in his denying being a communist. He was convicted and sentenced to 5 years. Shortly after, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were arrested for selling atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. They were convicted in 1951 and executed in the electric chair in 1953. And then the Cold War turns hot when the shooting starts in Korea. At the end of the war, when the Japanese had been evicted from Korea, a pro-communist government was set up in the north, a pro-Western government in the south, the boundary at the 38th parallel. And then in June 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. The Soviets and the North Koreans didn't think the United States would respond. But Truman went to the Security Council at the UN. The Security Council approved the use of force to resist this invasion. As it happened, the Soviet Union was boycotting the Security Council at the time for some political reason, and so they weren't there to veto. So the Security Council approved it. Truman sent 2 army divisions to Korea. The North Koreans almost made it. I don't know if you can read on that slide, but Pusan is a city at the very tip of the Korean Peninsula. The North Koreans almost got there. They pushed the South Koreans and the Americans down to the very bottom of the peninsula. And then General MacArthur pulled off a very clever landing up the coast at Incheon, and American forces sort of looped around behind the North Koreans and pushed them back. In the fall of 1950, we had returned to the original border, and then the question was, do American troops just keep on going and unify Korea, or do we stay put? MacArthur assured Truman that if we kept going and united the Koreas, the Chinese wouldn't do anything about it. And even if they did, they wouldn't be a problem. So, U.S. troops kept pushing up the peninsula. In November 1950, they had pushed the North Koreans just about up to the Yalu River, which is the border between North Korea and China. And as it turned out, the Chinese had not been listening to MacArthur. 250,000 Chinese soldiers came charging across the Yalu River. And they were much more formidable than MacArthur had thought, and they pushed the Americans back down the peninsula. And for the next 2 years, there's fighting up and down, kind of stabilizing about at the halfway point. While the Chinese were attacking and pushing American troops back, Truman announced, "Our homes, our nation, all the things we believe in are in great danger. This danger has been created by the rulers of the Soviet Union." I mean, so you can ask yourself, that's the Cold War mentality. All of this matters. The American freedom is at stake, is in danger based on anything that could happen in the world, pretty much. I mean, you could ask objectively, even if Korea went communist, would that really affect Americans on Main Street? You know, and the real answer is probably no, but that's with hindsight. At the time, it didn't feel that way. And so Truman's speech that everything we believe in is in jeopardy if we don't stand our ground in Korea made sense to most Americans. During the 1952 campaign, Republican candidate Dwight Eisenhower promised he would visit Korea personally and see if he could figure out a solution. Eisenhower won, and in early 1953, he went to Korea. You can see him having a meal and visiting with some of the American soldiers there. And he basically thought that the thing to do here is an armistice, pretty much drawing the border right where it had been. So it was an armistice was signed in mid-53, returning the status quo. I think it's safe to say if Truman had reached that deal, Republicans would have accused him of selling out. But because it was Eisenhower with his credibility, that his prestige made the settlement acceptable. The human cost of the Korean War, about 37,000 Americans killed, 100,000 wounded. The Korean military on both sides lost a whole lot more people. The Chinese army lost a heck of a lot of people. And in the fighting and the famine that resulted from the devastation of the countryside killed over 1.5 million Korean civilians. Now, how do you fight the Cold War? What's the strategy? Eisenhower's approach was he realized that the Soviet Union was pretty much always going to be able to field a bigger conventional army. It had more people. It was willing to have a lot more men under arms than Americans would pay for. On the other hand, America had an edge in technology. We had more atomic bombs. We had better bombers. And so Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, that's him talking to Eisenhower on the slide, Dulles announced that American policy would be instant, massive retaliation. You attack us or our allies, we will respond with nukes. It was known, the media coined the expression, more bang for the buck. Rather than spend a whole lot of money putting men in arms, we just build atomic bombs and the planes to deliver them. And American technology started developing other ways to deliver them. By 1960, we had a network of missile silos. So you didn't need a bomber to drop an atomic bomb on somebody. You could fire it in a missile. And then by 1960, submarines, Polaris missiles launched from submarines were a third way of sending atomic bombs in the direction of the Soviets. In 1950, it's estimated the United States had 370 nuclear warheads. In 1960, we had 40,000. Okay, so now let's broaden the horizons a bit in this discussion. How did the Cold War affect the rest of the world in various ways? So one consequence of World War II was the collapse of the European empires. Here's the map of what the Europeans thought they had when the war ended. So those colonies, I think you can see you can catch the colors there. British colonies are in red, so India, Pakistan, Burma, and then a whole vertical column of colonies running up the continent of Africa. France in blue had most of West Africa. It had Southeast Asia, and it had the island of Madagascar down in the southeast corner of Africa. Little Belgium had the Congo. It's the kind of light blue blotch in the center of Africa. The Netherlands controlled Indonesia. It was known as the Dutch East Indies at the time. So the Europeans wanted things to go back the way they had been with these colonies, but the people who lived there weren't really interested in having colonial rule reimposed on them. And the cost of maintaining empires became prohibitive for the European countries after World War II. In 1947, Britain decided it could no longer afford to control India, and it, in 1947, pulled out and created two countries. The idea was the Hindus would live in India, the Muslims in the subcontinent would move to what is now Pakistan. The division between India and Pakistan was intended to be a religious division, with the Hindus in one country and the Muslims in another. This process, the process of decolonization, occurred throughout the world during the 1950s. Soon there were dozens of new countries. In fact, by 1970, there were 4 times as many countries in the world as there had been in 1945. I don't know if you remember the headlines back then, but I do. To just, Nigeria goes independent, Cameroon becomes independent, Indonesia becomes independent. It was a regular feature of the news during the 50s and 60s. So what do those countries do faced with the Cold War? For many of the peoples in many of those countries, the Soviet model of the economy, break up the largest states, divide the land to the peasants, nationalize key industries for the benefit of everybody. The Soviet model to a lot of people seemed more attractive than just simply Western capitalism controlled by American and European businesses. But American leaders didn't appreciate the level of social inequality in many of these countries. And so America's default position was, if there's a popular movement resisting Western businesses, it must be communist inspired. That's how it seemed. It wasn't, my sense is that wasn't at all true. The communists weren't nearly as powerful as people were afraid they were. So one thing Americans did was to pump a whole lot of foreign aid to support military dictators and other strong regimes at the expense of popular movements. And in certain cases, we turned the CIA loose to try to help the forces of capitalism against popular movements. The two most prominent examples of the CIA getting involved are Iran and Guatemala. Iran was one of the major suppliers of oil in the world. In 1951, a popularly elected government, they had free elections in Iran. The popular leader nationalized British oil interests in Iran for the benefit of the Iranian people. The CIA funded a military coup to get rid of that fellow, whose name was Mossadegh, and put the Shah back in charge. That's the Shah sharing a smile with Eisenhower on the lower right. We funded the military coup. As a reward, American oil companies received a 40% interest in Iranian oil output. So we help you get rid of a popular government, and we get more oil in exchange. In 2009, President Obama formally acknowledged that the CIA had helped overthrow a democratically elected government in Iran. I mean, it took 40 years, but the American government finally admitted that that's what we'd done. Guatemala was another example. Guatemala, you might be interested to know, is the world's leading supplier of bananas. 2% of the population owned 80% of the land. The United Fruit Company owned half of Guatemala. And its profits, the United Fruit Company's profits, were twice the revenues of the government itself in Guatemala. A popularly elected government under Jacobo Arbenz expropriated all the United Fruit land that it wasn't using to distribute the land to peasants. The peasants had virtually nothing in that country. The CIA trained troops and supplied planes and pilots to help another military coup. Arbenz was thrown out and jailed, and I think he died pretty soon afterwards. Americans perceived this as a victory over communism, and there's a political cartoon in which Stalin is sort of strumming a guitar and singing, and somebody stereotypically looking Central American with that sombrero thing is dancing to Stalin's tune. That's how it was perceived, and in fact, John Foster Dulles called this ouster of the freely elected government in Guatemala the biggest success in the last 5 years against communism. To try to help capture how Americans perceived the world in the Cold War, maybe the best example we can go to is one of the more famous speeches in our history. So,
the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike, that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed, and to which we are committed today at home and around the world. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
So, I mean, that's Cold War mentality in a nutshell. We will pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, and oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty. That is the world as good versus evil, and we are on the side of good, and we'll do whatever it takes. As it turned out, the cost of doing all those things became more than Americans were willing to pay. Now, initially, after he took over, one of Kennedy's successes in the Cold War was the creation of the Peace Corps, which he did in his first months of office. By 1966, there were 15,000 American volunteers scattered around the Third World, helping in schools, health clinics, teaching agricultural methods. It was a great example of what American idealism can do and helped generate a great deal of favorable press for America within other parts of the world. Other parts of the Cold War didn't go quite so well for Kennedy, Cuba being the prime example. In the 1950s, the United States pumped a lot of money into the military dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. And the reason we did that is because American firms controlled 25% of the banks, 40% of the sugar production, and 90% of the mines on Cuba. But in 1959, Fidel Castro's popular movement overthrew Batista. There on the slide, by the way, you've got, on the lower left, you've got Castro and Che Guevara celebrating. At first, Castro got favorable press in the US because Batista had been such a bad dictator. But then Castro nationalized $1 billion worth of property owned by Americans and started accepting aid from the Soviet Union. So now we're faced with a Soviet ally 90 miles away from Florida. In March 1960, Eisenhower approved a CIA plan to train a paramilitary force of anti-Castro Cubans who would invade Cuba and get rid of Castro. So Kennedy becomes president, and everybody tells him about the great plan they've got. And Kennedy's advisors assured him that the Cuban people would rise up joyfully at the thought of being liberated from Castro. So he approved the go-ahead. American ships escorted the anti-Castro Cubans on their way to the Bay of Pigs on the south side of Cuba. Everything went wrong. Castro knew perfectly well they were coming. As soon as they landed, they were surrounded by Cuban troops. The Cuban people had no interest in getting rid of Castro and did nothing to help the invaders. 100 of the invaders were killed, the rest were captured. It was a huge public relations disaster for Kennedy. And one thing it did was, Kennedy told an aide, "All my life I've known better than to depend on the experts. How could I have been so stupid as to let them go ahead?" But he'd only been in office a couple of months. He did what he thought was the thing he was supposed to do, but it was a bad mistake. On the other hand, the CIA continued to come up with plans to try to get rid of Castro. I read somewhere that they've counted at least 30 CIA schemes to assassinate Castro, with things like exploding cigars. And it sounds like a bad movie, some of it. Now, a visible symbol of the Cold War, good versus evil, came along a couple of months later in Berlin. East Germans, without a fence, without a big border fence, East Germans were leaving the country at the rate of 1,000 people a day to go to try to get to West Germany. So in August 1961, the Soviets started building a wall around East Berlin and the border to keep the East Germans in. The Berlin Wall was kind of proof for Americans that living under communism was a lot like being in prison. It's a fair point. Fortunately, the Soviet Union didn't stop American troops from supplying West Berlin. They just put up the fence to keep the East Berliners inside. The next crisis was the most scary part of the Cold War, and that took place in the fall of 1962 when American spy planes revealed the construction of missile silos on the island of Cuba. Now, I don't know what you're looking at there. I know the missile in the upper right, that's from some parade, but the satellite photos on the left there, I don't know what I'm looking at, but apparently if you know what you're looking at, that is evidence that the Soviets were building missile silos on Cuba. Can we silence that, please? Whatever that is. Thank you. Apparently not. Thank you. Okay, so it appeared from analyzing photos like that the Soviets were helping the Cubans build missile silos that could launch missiles with a 1,000-mile range, which would hit the southeastern United States. There were secret round-the-clock meetings in the White House for the next several days. Here are a few of the photos. You've got Kennedy on the upper left there, Kennedy conferring with Secretary of State Dean Rusk and Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. The photo on the right, you've got Lyndon Johnson sitting next to Robert Kennedy. Lots of discussions about what to do. Not surprisingly, the Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to invade Cuba. It was McNamara who came up with the idea of a blockade. If you blockade it with the US Navy, that would stop the Soviets from continuing and create leverage to try to get them to leave. So Kennedy went on television to announce a quarantine, and here's a clip from his speech.
I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
So that last sentence is the key, right? We will regard any missile launched from Cuba aimed anywhere as an attack on us by the Soviet Union, requiring a full retaliatory response. Basically, a trigger-happy officer, Soviet officer or Cuban officer on Cuba could have pushed a button and started World War III. It really was that close. But instead, fortunately, nobody on Cuba did that. The Soviet ships turned around, didn't try to run the blockade, and a deal was reached. The Soviet Union publicly promised to remove the missiles. The United States publicly promised not to invade Cuba. And the United States secretly promised to remove missiles, American missiles in Turkey that are aimed at the Soviet Union. Kennedy's approval rating reached 77% after the way he handled this. Now, the biggest disaster in America's handling of the Cold War, of course, is the Vietnam War. Some quick background. As I mentioned, Indochina was controlled by the French after the war, and they wanted to keep their colonies, but there were nationalist movements in Southeast Asia. One of the leaders in Southeast Asia fighting the French was Ho Chi Minh. As a young man, he had worked on a French steamship and toured the world. He actually lived in the United States for a while. Would you believe Ho Chi Minh was a baker at the Parker House Hotel in downtown Boston for a period of time in the 1920s? Yes, he was a baker at the Parker House. He then went to Moscow and studied revolutionary theory, among other things, and then went to Vietnam and led guerrilla forces against the Japanese. In 1945, the Japanese are evicted, and Ho Chi Minh and his group issued a Declaration of Independence for Vietnam, in which they said all people are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This immortal statement was made in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America, and in a broader sense, this means that all peoples on the earth are equal from birth, and all peoples have a right to live, to be happy, and to be free. Vietnam has the right to be a free and independent country. Ho Chi Minh asked Truman for support to protect Vietnamese independence, but instead Truman was committed to helping the French regain control over their colonies, and so they ignored Ho Chi Minh. By 1954, the United States had spent $3 billion trying to help the French hold on to Vietnam. Nevertheless, in May 1954, the French army got trapped in an obscure location in northern Vietnam. They were surrounded by the nationalist forces of Ho Chi Minh. The French asked them for American help. You gotta love these guys. The Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted Eisenhower to send in the planes, send in the troops, and drop tactical nuclear weapons. Eisenhower said to them, quote, "You boys must be crazy. We can't use those awful things against Asians for the second time in 10 years. My God." So Eisenhower had sense, fortunately. But without a rescue from the United States, the French surrendered. There was an international conference in Geneva with the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China, and the group adopted what were known as the Geneva Accords. They divided Vietnam halfway up at the 17th parallel. The idea was that there would be free elections 2 years later. So free elections in 1956, in which the Vietnamese people would choose whether they wanted to be unified or not. And the agreement was that no outside country would provide either side with weapons in the interim. The leader of South Vietnam in this period was Ngo Dinh Diem. He's in the center of the slide. Nobody honored the Geneva Accords. The Soviets and the Chinese supplied North Vietnam. We supplied South Vietnam. The CIA helped Diem win a referendum with 98% of the vote. And then the United States basically told Diem, don't hold those free elections because everybody knows you're going to lose. And so the elections never happened. Between 1955 and 1961, we provided $1.5 billion of aid to the Diem government. It was the 5th largest total we gave to any country in the world. This is a really good example of how the Cold War affected people's mentalities. Vietnam is a little bit bigger than New Mexico. It has no natural resources. Vietnam is only really, geographically at least, it's only a good place to grow rice. It had no strategic value unless you look at the world as everything is about freedom versus communism, and a communist regime anywhere is a threat to all of us. With that mentality, pumping all that money into South Vietnam made sense. The United States provided thousands of military advisors to try to help the Diem government resist the communist forces. By 1963, when Kennedy was assassinated, we had 17,000 military advisors helping out. Lyndon Johnson takes over after the assassination, and Defense Secretary McNamara told Johnson the communists controlled 40% of South Vietnam, and in some places they had 90%. Johnson dodged the issue until after the '64 election, but things then got worse. In February 1965, the Viet Cong attacked a U.S. air base at Pleiku. Johnson ordered a bombing campaign that lasted for the next 3 years. A month later, Johnson sent in 3,500 Marines to guard the U.S. air bases. It was the first time American combat troops had set foot in Vietnam. And then in April 1965, General William Westmoreland said, I could really use 175,000 American troops to try to win this thing. McNamara advised Johnson to give Westmoreland what he wanted. The theory was, if you pump in a lot of American troops, in the short term, we can stabilize things until the South Vietnamese can defend themselves. Something that was, never going to happen. Okay, I don't know what that is. Okay, so why do we... Can we please not do that? Thank you. So why did Johnson commit over 100,000 American troops? He told a reporter, I don't believe I can walk out. If I did, they'd take Thailand. They'd take Cambodia. They'd take Burma. They'd take Indonesia. They'd take India. They'd come right back and take the Philippines. I'd be another Neville Chamberlain, and we'd have another Munich. Just the theory, the scars of the appeasement of Hitler in the 1930s were still with American leaders. We can't make that mistake again. You've always got to stand up to the dictators and stand up to the villains. So Johnson kept sending men, more and more Americans. By 1968, we had over 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam. victory was still nowhere in sight. This isn't time. I don't have time today for much more about the Vietnam War in any detail. Johnson decided not to run for re-election. Richard Nixon was the Republican candidate. Nixon told one of his speechwriters during the campaign, "I've come to the conclusion that there's no way to win the war." But we can't say that, of course. In fact, we have to seem to say the opposite. So Nixon's strategy for trying to win the war was to wind down the use of American ground troops, because if he could wind down the US ground troops, he could cut back on the draft, which would defuse the student protest movement. And instead, Nixon wanted to rely on American planes to bomb the North Vietnamese to the treaty table. In 1973, Nixon and Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor, finally reached a deal with the North Vietnamese. America would withdraw all its troops within 60 days. The North Vietnamese would release American POWs. The people of South Vietnam would decide their own future. But it was a ceasefire that left nearly 200,000 communist troops in South Vietnam. And with Democrats in Congress pulling the plug on military aid for the South Vietnamese government, it was inevitable that the South Vietnamese government would fall. The communists seized Saigon 2 years later, in May 1975. The cost of the Vietnam War. Total casualties for the United States, I've got the figures up there, 58,000 killed, 150,000 wounded. As usual, the others, because of American firepower, it's easier for Americans to kill the other folks than it is for them to kill us. So you've got the South Vietnamese army losing a good number of people, the communist forces losing over 1 million people, and naturally it's the civilians who bear the worst of it. The estimates are that 2 million Vietnamese civilians died, north and south. Now, Richard Nixon was a crook who resigned in disgrace, right? We can all agree on that. But he also gets Nixon deserves some credit for trying to see his way through the Cold War and reach a more rational way of approaching relations with the communist countries. In February 1972, Nixon shocked people by deciding to visit China. He met with, there's Nixon shaking hands with Mao. There's Nixon toasting with Chow Enlai. It was a shock to American conservatives in particular. William F. Buckley wrote this incredibly angry editorial about how could we possibly be doing this. But Nixon was smart. He wanted to drive a wedge between the Chinese and the Soviets by playing them off against each other. He was also hoping the Chinese would help him gain leverage over the North Vietnamese. So there he is, walking on the Great Wall and saying hello to a tiny Chinese girl. I think he's trying to be friendly. I can't tell if she's scared or not, but the way he's looming over her. But in any event, so he goes to China. That was really a bright thing to do. And then a few months later, he goes to Russia. He meets with Premier Kosygin and Communist Party leader Brezhnev and signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty that froze the number of missiles and the number of ICBMs and sub-based missiles for 5 years. That was a major deal. And then Nixon and Gerald Ford, who succeeded him, pursued a policy of what they like to call détente, trying to smooth out, improve relations with the Soviet Union. Nixon and Ford agreed to grain sales. The Soviet economy never seemed to be able to produce enough wheat to feed its own people. American farmers are really good at growing wheat, and so there were multi-million-dollar grain deals in which Americans would help the Soviets, and some symbolic gestures like a joint space mission, the Soyuz Apollo in 1975. Jimmy Carter tried to continue the policy of détente. He signed the SALT II arms control treaty with Brezhnev. That's them signing it on the upper left. He also tried to push the issue of human rights in American foreign policy in a way that hadn't been done before. He imposed an arms embargo on countries that had a terrible human rights record, like South Africa and Rhodesia, which were still living with the apartheid system of segregation. He pushed for returning the Panama Canal to the government of Panama, and that's him waving with the president of Panama, General Torrijos. And in his greatest success was getting Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin together to talk the possibility of peace in the Middle East. I'm going to say a little more about this next time. But they signed a deal to try to return the Sinai to Egypt and to establish Palestinian self-government. Despite the progress in the 1970s, in 1980, the world was still divided in two armed camps. You've got NATO in dark blue and American Western allies in light blue on the map, the Soviets and their allies in dark red, some other Marxist regimes scattered around in pink. The Soviet Union was supporting the Palestine Liberation Organization and supplying weapons to a lot of countries like Iraq and Syria. So the world was still complex, but détente had made some progress on things, and then détente really died when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in December 1979. There was a pro-Soviet government in Afghanistan. There was a Islamic resistance to that government that was threatening to overthrow it. The Soviets sent in their troops to protect the pro-Soviet government. Carter authorized the CIA to arm the Afghan resistance. Ironically, we spent $30 million over the next number of years providing weapons to these radical Islamic folks so they could fight the Soviets. Carter approved a big increase in the defense budget. He canceled the latest grain sale to the Soviet Union, and he announced that we wouldn't go to the Moscow Olympics, which were scheduled for 1980. A move that was very unpopular with the American people, as it turned out. And he asked the Senate to not approve that SALT arms control treaty that he had negotiated with Brezhnev. So the Cold War starts getting uglier at the end of Carter's administration, and then it reaches a new level rhetorically with Ronald Reagan. Reagan, and this, one of our themes comes back here, Reagan deeply believed that America has a special, you might say, divine mission in the world. He said in one of his speeches, "We did not seek world leadership, it was thrust upon us." You could question that, but in any event, it was thrust upon us. It has been our destiny almost from the first moment this land was settled. I believe God had a divine purpose in placing this land between the two great oceans to be found by those who had a special love of freedom. Now, you might ask, what about the Indians who were already living here when the Europeans with their special love of freedom showed up and kicked them out? But that wasn't part of what Reagan's view of things. In March 1983, Reagan attended a conference of evangelicals at which he gave a famous speech denouncing the Soviet Union as an evil empire. He backed up his rhetoric with a massive increase in American defense spending, the B-1 bombers, MX missiles, the neutron bomb, new chemical weapons, and his favorite was what was officially called the Strategic Defense Initiative. You all remember this? The idea that there would be satellites that could shoot down Soviet missiles on their way in. He called it SDI, but the media immediately started calling it Star Wars after the movie franchise. That was a big deal at the time. I love the political cartoon there. There's Reagan explaining some of the advisors to the Star Wars program. And if you look closely, that's C-3PO from Star Wars and E.T. from the Spielberg movie. They're the experts. Oh, and and R2-D2's in there too. Yeah. Reagan was obsessed with the danger of communism in Central America. He and his advisors broke the law to provide aid to the folks, the Contras, who were trying to overthrow the Marxist government in Nicaragua. Reagan never did propose sending U.S. troops to help in Nicaragua, but he did actually, do you remember we invaded someplace? Where's my slide going here? There we go. Grenada. Who of you could find that on a map? It would take me quite a while. So Grenada is a tiny little island in the Caribbean, kind of near Venezuela. It had 89,000 people, which I discovered is the same size as the city of Lawrence. In 1982, Marxists, aided by the Cubans, took power on Grenada. And there were 800 Cubans on the island of Grenada building a new airport, supposedly for tourism, but you never know. So Reagan claimed that Grenada was a threat to the free world, and in October 1983, we invaded Grenada with 7,000 troops, supposedly to defend American medical students who were on the island. When they were first interviewed, the American medical students said, we weren't worried about anything, everything was fine. Then they got home and were told what to say, and the message became, oh, we were terrified, thank God they came when they did. But it was essentially nonsense. 19 Americans were killed, 59 Cubans were killed. The United Nations General Assembly condemned what we did by 108 to 9. Reagan didn't care, and Reagan announced, our days of weakness are over. Our military forces are back on their feet and standing tall. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm just a cynic, but the idea of kicking around a few hundred Cubans doesn't exactly strike me as the way to defeat Vietnam syndrome, but that was at least the spin that Reagan put on it. So, but just when it looked like the Cold War was getting colder, this guy shows up, Mikhail Gorbachev. Took power in the Soviet Union in 1985. He knew that the Soviet system needed huge changes. He knew that the Soviet Union could not afford to keep competing with the United States militarily. At that time, the United States was spending $35 million on defense every hour. That would be about $110 million today, every hour. Gorbachev knew that the Soviet Union couldn't keep funding all those Marxist revolutionary groups in other countries. He also believed that by lifting some of the censorship and making room in the Soviet economy for some level of individual choice, that he could actually strengthen the communist system in the Soviet Union. As part of that process, he released the last of the political prisoners, and he also announced that the Soviet Union would stop nuclear testing. He made so many interesting announcements that sounded favorable that they led to a series of summits between Reagan and Gorbachev. And the guys got along. It's wacky. I mean, if you read about it, they actually hit it off. They started having discussions about maybe we should just get rid of the nuclear weapons entirely. Gorbachev proposed cutting back on the number of Soviet missiles in Europe, and that both sides should do it. Reagan said, well, why don't we just get rid of all of them within 10 years? Their advisors are following them. This was at the summit in Reykjavik. Their advisors are following them around like, oh my God, what are these guys doing? Are they really going to end the arms race right here by themselves? And, Reagan and Gorbachev almost reached an agreement to just start scrapping the nuclear weapons on both sides, except Gorbachev needed Reagan to give up on the Star Wars idea because he knew the Soviets couldn't afford to compete with that. And Reagan wasn't prepared to let go of Star Wars.
If you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Reagan kept up the pressure on Gorbachev, like that visit to Berlin. He then had another conference with Gorbachev at the end of 1987, and they actually did reach a deal to start removing intermediate-range nuclear missiles from Europe. It was the first time that the two sides agreed to not only limit their weapons, but actually start destroying some of the ones they already had and dismantling them. Reagan visited Moscow in May 1988. Somebody asked him whether he still thought the Soviet Union was an evil empire. And he said, no, you are talking about another time and another era. And you know, I don't think I've hidden the fact that I'm cynical about a number of the things that Reagan did. Politically, I find a lot of what he did disturbing, but he was really clever. He was able to see that Gorbachev was different. He was able to see the potential for progress, and he liked defense spending, but he was genuinely terrified of what nuclear war would mean and wanted to do anything he could to avoid that happening. The reason he couldn't let go of Star Wars was because he thought that was the ultimate insurance policy against a nuclear war. So, and you know, his conservative advisors and the conservatives in the Congress and in the media were shocked that he would take Gorbachev seriously and make some of these deals, but Reagan had the courage and the intelligence to do it. In December 1988, Gorbachev came to the UN, and in that speech he said, "It is obvious that the use or the threat of force can no longer be an instrument of foreign policy. It is quite clear that freedom of choice is mandatory. Freedom of choice is the principle that should always control. The time has come to discard the idea of teaching the other side your brand of democracy. We have to stop thinking that way." Basically, what he was signaling is that the Red Army was not going to intervene in Eastern Europe, and they weren't going to intervene. And it was a signal for the countries in Eastern Europe to start questioning what their regimes, and one after another, things changed in Eastern Europe. In August 1989, there were free elections in Poland. The independent labor union Solidarity won 160 out of 161 seats. That's Lech Walesa, the leader of Solidarity there on the slide. So everybody, suddenly Solidarity wins the election in Poland. Everybody looks to see what Gorbachev is going to do. Gorbachev told the Council of Europe, "This is exclusively a matter for the people themselves to decide. Any interference in internal affairs, including friends and allies, is impermissible." So that's it. The Soviet army is not going to come in and rescue the communists in Poland. One Eastern European country after another started getting rid of its communist monopoly, opening up its political process to multiple parties. You've got rallies in Wenceslas Square in Prague, in Bucharest, in Lithuania. And the most visible example, Berlin, November 1989. East German leaders announced that they were preparing to lift some of the travel restrictions on travel between East Berlin and West Berlin. That night, thousands of young East Berliners decided they wanted to go visit West Berlin right now. A large crowd gathers at the checkpoints. The officers decide rather than try to control the crowd, or certainly rather than shoot at them, they just lifted the gates. And East Berliners start thronging through the gates visiting West Berlin, and pretty soon people are dancing on the wall. Do you remember that? My son Charlie was a month old, and I'm sitting there watching TV, nurse holding the bottle, and Charlie and I are watching this, and I'm just thinking, holy cow, I am seeing people dancing on the Berlin Wall? I mean, who expected that? So the next day, East Berliners start taking sledgehammers to the wall. A few months after that, Germany was reunified. Now, the top communists and top military officers in the Soviet Union decided they had enough. And in August of 1991, they confined Gorbachev to his country house on the Black Sea, and they sent the tanks into Moscow to try to restore order. The Soviet Union was technically a collection of nominally independent republics, the Russian Federation, the Kazakh Federation, Ukraine, a number of them. Boris Yeltsin was the president of the Russian Federation. He called on the people of Moscow to resist the troops, and he called on the Soviet troops to not pull the trigger. And you had crowds surrounding the troops in the streets, surrounding the tanks. So you had people putting flowers in the barrels of the Soviet tanks there on the lower left. And it worked. The troops did not open fire. The coup failed. And at that point, within just the next few months, the Soviet Union disintegrated. Each of the republics declared its independence. On December 8th, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus voted to dissolve the Soviet Union. The other republics agreed. On Christmas Day, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union. The red hammer and sickle flag came down. The red, white, and blue flag of the czars went back up. I don't know how I came across this on the internet, but that Greenville News headline is one of the best headlines I have ever seen. Gorbachev quits as president of country that no longer exists. I mean, that's pretty clever. And so, a few months later, the President George H.W. Bush and Boris Yeltsin get together and raise a glass to the end of the Cold War. It's over. And so just a couple final points, and thank you for your patience today. Did the United States win the Cold War? Sure, right? I mean, we're still here, and the Soviet Union is not. Why did we win the Cold War? Partly the Soviet command economy was just hopelessly inefficient. The Soviets never were able to marshal their economic resources. You know, you can be a cynic about some things, but on some levels, capitalism works pretty well. And the American economy works pretty well, and the Soviets could not possibly keep up over the long haul with what the American economy could do, that we could spend that much on defense every hour and still have a pretty good lifestyle for our people, on average for our people, whereas, the Soviet consumers were always looking at empty shelves. So the Soviet system was flawed, and the American economy and our willingness to spend a whole lot of money on defense won the day. 1991, 1992, the Cold War ends. The United States is once again by far the most powerful country on the planet. And there were many Americans who thought that with the Soviets gone, we can pretty much do whatever we want. And so what we're going to start talking about next week and the one after is, it hasn't quite worked out that way. But it's what it seemed. There was a brief moment, and also just quickly, there was a brief moment where people thought that Russia would become a kind of liberal capitalist country, right? With free elections and all kinds of good stuff. But sadly, things didn't go that way for Russia either. Anyway, I hope that wasn't too much of my yakking. Thank you all for being here. Monday at 2. Thank you.